If I haven't met you, my name is Joel, and I'm one of the pastors of Five Points Church. Our church started a little over a year and a half ago, and God has us here in the middle of Athens in this neighborhood of 5 Points, and we are excited to proclaim the gospel of Jesus. And Psalm 14 is a glimpse of the gospel in the Old Testament. You know, we fast forward into the New Testament, we get the story of Jesus, that we know the gospel, that Jesus came and lived a perfect life, and he died on the cross, taking our sins on himself. But in Psalm 14, thousands of years before that happened, we get a glimpse of why that was needed and how it might come about. And so this is a really exciting psalm to look at. Again, if you don't have your Bible there, check this out with me. We're going to look at verse 1 to start off, where it says, "The fool says in his heart, 'There is no God.' They are corrupt. They do abominable deeds. There is none who does good." That's verse 1. Just to give you an idea of the fool, I can pick through a bunch of stories of my own life. It's not hard for me to find a few stories. In fact, Jennifer, my wife, will tell you that one of the funniest stories, one of the funniest moments of her entire life happened when the two of us went hiking back before we have 5 kids, and back before they all came along, and we were chasing them everywhere, and these small humans just cause all this chaos. Before all that, we like to hike a lot. Now we get to every now and then, but back then we did it a lot. And we were hiking one day, the two of us, and we were in this kind of valley area. We were crossing over some streams, and I was so proud because I had on my new pair of boots. They were Timberlands, and they were nice. And this was a few years back. I don't own these shoes anymore, but I wish I did. They were so nice. They were rugged. Best of all, I got them for half off. I was so proud of these shoes. So I'm like Bear Grylls, just walking through the trail, making my way. And as we crossed these streams, my wife kept saying, I can't cross here very well. My feet are getting wet. I don't like this. And I was like, well, you don't have Timberlands like me that are waterproof. And if you did, you'd be okay. And I'm just crossing the streams with my feet going through the water because these are waterproof Timberlands. So I'm feeling real good, just like leading an expedition through the jungle, even though it was wide open and pretty easy. And as I make my way to the next stream, I'm about to just charge through like I've done all the way up until that point. And my wife sees something that I don't really see. And she says, "I don't know if I were you, if I would do that." Have you ever heard those words? If I were you, I don't know if I'd do that. And there's something in our minds that go, we'll show them. It's like that clicks and we're like, I'm pressing on even more. And so, of course, as soon as I heard that, I was like, she doesn't know what I'm wearing today. Has she not heard the last mile, how good these boots are? She doesn't understand. So I charged to that stream, and sure enough, I hit a rock that was a little deeper than I expected and a little more slippery than I expected. And no longer were my shoes dry. My entire body was wet, everything. I slipped on that rock and just boom into the water. Actually, I think my feet might have been dry, the rest of me wet, now that I think about it. Soaking wet. And all I hear is laughter. My wife is over there laughing so hard, and I'm soaking wet in this creek, in this stream. And I stand up, and as I'm standing up, I'm just all I hear is laughter. I'm like, you're going to wake up all the animals. You're laughing so hard at me. This is not funny. And then I realize in that moment that I have this incredible pain shooting down my neck and into my shoulder. And I realized that my shoulder had come out of socket. And my wife's still laughing, and my arm's hanging there. I'm like, what are you laughing at? You can't laugh at me right now. My shoulder's out of socket. So, good news. I had played football long enough that this has happened to me a few times, so I know what to do. And I pop the shoulder back in, and so it gets back in. It just hurts a little bit, actually a lot, but it was back in place. And I walk out of that stream, soaking wet, with a limp, and my wife's still laughing to this day about that. So she said, if I were you, I wouldn't do that. And I said, I will have nothing to do with your advice. Now, that's a very small example, and we could come up with much bigger examples. Like, for example, the Titanic. This is like the story that we tell as a warning, right? When everybody, the engineers, whoever was a part of that ship, the press, they were all saying the same thing. This boat is unsinkable. It was even said that they said even God couldn't sink the ship. And we know the story, that boat tore through an iceberg and the hull ripped and there wasn't enough lifeboats. And that was all after they had been warned, right? There was warnings that said, you're about to go through an iceberg. You guys watch out. You can't do that. And they went ahead because they said this boat will never sink. That's the idea of a fool. When you think of a fool, this is kind of where your mind needs to go. A fool isn't necessarily somebody with a low IQ. A fool is not necessarily someone who makes a mistake here or there. A fool is someone, and this is the biblical definition, a fool is someone who has been given advice and totally disregards it. If you look at the Proverbs and you look at how a fool is described, it's someone who has in front of them information that they could take and use in their life, and they say, no, I'm good. Here, David says in this psalm, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And this is sort of the epitome, this is the deepest point in which someone who acts foolish, who can be a fool, gets to this point, right here. Because they are disregarding what's clearly in front of them. And that is evidence for God. We have all kinds of evidence for God. I thought about today doing like an apologetic for how we can know and trust and believe that there is a God. And you can look at all the arguments for God. I can give you lots of resources for people who do that so well, that give you arguments for God, why you can believe there's a God. But I said, I don't know if that's where we need to go today. The bottom line is that when you think about a fool, you think about this person who's saying in their heart, there is no God. They're disregarding any evidence and any even outright like revelation by God to them. The fool says in their heart, there is no God. I want you to notice that this is David's assessment. When he's the author of this psalm, and he says, when I look around, what I see are fools. They're people who are saying there's no God, they're corrupt, they do these abominable deeds, there's none who do good. The word he uses is for fool is the Hebrew word naval. This word is interesting because it's actually the name of a character in the Old Testament. In 1 Samuel 25, there's a man, we would call him Nabal, and it's the same exact Hebrew word. So he was literally, I don't know, like his mom, what she was doing, but she named him fool. And the story goes like this, that David and his men, this is when he was on the run, and he's got 400 men who are with him, and they're kind of just like nomads roaming around. And they're looking for places and food and like shelter. And as they had been making their way around, they had run into Nabal. Now listen, he's this successful guy. If any of you would have met him, you would have never thought, okay, this guy's a fool. Think of this successful business person that you may have met before. Think of this person who maybe is a little bit ruthless in their business. But yet they have made a great career and fortune. Okay, that's Nabal. And when David and his men were out and about, they came across some of his shepherds and they protected his shepherds. After protecting his shepherds, at some point, David asked sort of to repay the favor. He sends some of his men and says, hey, look, can we have some supplies? Can we have some food? Is there anything you can do to help us right now? And Nabal, get this, is like, nope. I'm not going to have anything to do with you. Like, who are you, David? I think you ran away from your servant and you're like in rebellion. I'm not going to help you. And so David is like, all right, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to get me and my 400 guys, and we're going to go and we're going to wipe you out completely. Because you're a fool, just like your name. It reminds me of like my kids when we go to the pool. I remember when they were real little, we'd go to the pool and there'd be like water guns, and they would go pick up a little water gun and they would fill it up with water, and they'd come up to me and they thought they were going to get me so bad, and they would squirt me, and a little trickle would come out of this little water gun. And then what I would do, of course, as any good dad would do, I'd go over and I'd find one of those like noodle guns. I don't know what they call those, but the ones that you like pull into the water and out comes like a hydro like thing, and I would pull it out and I would just spray. Anytime they got an idea like that in their head, I squashed it. Okay, that's how I work as a dad, and I would pull that water thing out and I would just until they were like falling on their backs and the kids were begging for mercy. It got bad. Okay, I'm just kidding. That never happened. But I would just, they would squirt me with this little squirt gun. They would think, oh, I'm going to get him, Dad, we're going to take Dad out now. And then I'd just come back like that. That's sort of like this, how it works with David and Nabal here, that David's like, we're going to go wipe him out. Abigail, his wife, comes out and offers these resources and even more. And she says, look, my husband has lived up to his name. He truly is a fool. That's what a fool is. I've spent a little time here describing a fool. I told a personal story about a fool because here's what we're going to see in this psalm. That although he says, the fool says in his heart there is no God, and none of us want to admit and say, that's us. The truth is, this is us. We're the fool. You say, well, I don't say there is no God. Let me just pull back there for a second. Because notice in verse 1, that he says, the fool says in his heart. So he's not saying the fool says on his YouTube channel that's labeled atheist for everyone. It says the fool says in his heart, meaning it is not necessarily advertised out loud, but in his heart, in his actions, what he does. I can do this in those moments where I'm like, God, I just don't want to hear you right now. I don't want to do this thing that you're telling me to do, so please just... I'm going to act like you're not there. When I choose sin, when you and I choose sin, and we say, I prefer this moment right here where I would take what I would want and not do what God would want. In those moments, we're turning into a practical atheist. You heard that phrase before, a practical atheist, meaning we're acting like God doesn't exist. Not saying it, but living it. Like God doesn't exist. We do that when we sin and when we turn our own way. I think of Jonah. Jonah gets a message from God, go preach to the Ninevites, and he's like, I don't want to do that. And he runs off his own direction. That's a practical atheist. Although he knows God and he hears from God, he says, I'm going to forget God. And we all can do that. So the fool says in his heart, there is no God. We can do that all the time. You know, you can argue that the four most important words in the Bible are in Genesis 1:1. In the beginning, God. That's where everything starts. That's where the world starts, and that's where our lives start. And so for us to fall back into a place where we would say there is no God truly makes us a fool. Now that's David's assessment. In verse 2, we get God's assessment. Look at that next. The Lord looks down from heaven on the children of man to see if there's any who understand, who seek after God. So here's God looking out. Not just one person, this is God's verdict, heaven's verdict. Verse 3 says, they have all turned aside. Together they have become corrupt. There is none who do good, not even one. No one. This is what we call total depravity. When you hear the word total depravity, the phrase total depravity, don't think like this is someone who's totally depraved, like they're totally evil. No, this is someone, total depravity, this is all of us, where in every part of who we are, sin has infected us. Okay? We don't sin and then become sinners. We're sinners, therefore we sin. David says in Psalm 51, surely my mother conceived me in sin. That in us is this innate movement towards sin. I didn't have to teach any of my kids how to steal or to lie, and they all are thieves and liars. Well, my kids are kind of getting a bad rap today. Sorry, they're great kids. I love them. I promise. Well, I really am. Okay, I'm feeling bad now, but it's true of all of us. And notice in Psalm 14, you'll see words like none, all, not even one. Nobody escapes this verdict. We all at one point or another play the part of the fool. Look at verse 4 next. Have they no knowledge? All the evildoers who eat up my people as they eat bread and do not call upon the Lord. Right? So there's a progression. First, the fool says in his heart, there is no God. Then they turn aside, they do evil, and then they oppress others. This is a good picture of Pharaoh. We went through Exodus, and Pharaoh, with God's people, he enslaved them, and then he over and over, as especially as Moses comes face to face with him, he oppresses them in a way where he eats them up like bread, very similar to the phrase that David uses here. So this is how sin works. Sin is progressive. Sin, as it takes hold in our life, as James tells us, it grows and it brings forth death. Then look at verse 5 next, because this is sort of a jump. After all that, he says, there they are in great terror, for God is with the generation of the righteous. So it switches. The fools think that they're in control, and it looks like everybody out there is playing the part of the fool. There's no one who does good. There's no one who's righteous. But now they're in terror. Even though they think they're winning, when God sees them and when God's face comes against them, they will be in terror. C.S. Lewis wrote in The Weight of Glory, in the end, that face, capital F, face, which is the delight or the terror of the universe, must be turned upon each of us, either conferring glory inexpressible or inflicting shame that can never be cured or disguised. C.S. Lewis is saying that in the end, when God's face goes towards us, it will be terror for those who do not know him, who have not been covered by Jesus' blood, but it will be glory inexpressible for those who have. That's what verse 5 tells us as well, that God is with the generation of the righteous. Now, you might be asking, wait a second. If there's no one righteous, how is there a generation of the righteous? And this psalm kind of hides for us a gospel message that there's none who are righteous, and yet there are righteous. How is that possible? Well, if there's no one is righteous and no one does good, the only possible way that there can be righteous is if God confers righteousness on them. And that's the story of the Bible, that God confers righteousness on the unrighteous. And that's what we're seeing here, that there is a generation of righteous. There are people who turn to God, whose hearts no longer say there is no God, but yet there is a God. His name is Jehovah. Verse 6 goes on to say, you would shame the plans of the poor, but the Lord is his refuge. So who is it that gets God? It's the poor. It's the needy. It's those who come to God realizing that they have nothing to offer. And the Lord becomes a refuge. Now, it's been on our slide, but I didn't say this at the beginning. These verses 1 through 6 are what I call a true assessment. David gives us a true assessment of humanity. And we have to ask ourselves, what path are we on? Are we the fool that says, I've got this? Or are we the righteous that says, I don't have this? God, I don't believe in you, or God, I need you. That's the assessment of humanity. Now into verse 7, and this is what I call a trusted anticipation. So that's a true assessment. Here's a trusted anticipation. Last verse of the psalm, before we get to a quick application. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. When the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, let Jacob rejoice and let Israel be glad. So it's gone from this sort of like very depressed assessment of how there's no one who does good, there's no one that's righteous, and look at the evildoers, look how they think they're winning. And he says, oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. Zion in the Old Testament is the place where God dwells. It's the mount where the temple sits. It's where God himself made him present to his people. And David says, oh, that God would come out of Zion, that salvation would come from there. And then he says, this is so great, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. David believes with all his heart that salvation will come out of Zion, that God will save. And when that happens, when the Lord restores the fortunes of his people, he says, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. Very small thing, but very significant thing in what the psalmist says here. He says, let Jacob rejoice, let Israel be glad. It sounds like poetic repetition because Jacob and Israel are the same. Jacob gets the name Israel. But I want you to think about, before Jacob becomes Israel, Jacob is a trickster. He's a scoundrel. And that's what his whole life identity has been. And then one night, he wrestles with God. And when he wrestles with God, he comes out of that wrestling match. This is a fascinating story. You can go read it. When he comes out of that wrestling match, he's given a new name, Israel. And God puts a new identity on him. Says that you will be my people. You've gone from trickster to a chosen one by God. And this is the story of the gospel. Psalm 14, I hope you see, even in the Old Testament, way before Jesus ever walked the earth, I hope you see this beautiful picture of the story that God writes. That we are all fools, but here's the good news, and this is the main point I want to make today. We are all fools, but here's the good news. God saves fools. Somebody in there needs to be like, amen. We are all fools, but God saves fools. G.K. Chesterton wrote a response to a letter. This is back in 1905. And there was a letter that I had written into one of the newspapers that asked the question, what's wrong with the world? Nothing's changed. But we're all asking the same question. What's wrong with the world? Why does the world feel so broken? I talk to so many people, and I ask them questions like that as a pastor. That's what we do. We say, like, hey, what do you think is wrong with the world? Do you feel that? Yeah, I feel like the world's pretty broken. It's pretty messed up. People are dropping bombs on other people. What's wrong with the world? And this was sort of an op-ed that someone wrote. Chesterton responded to that with his own letter. And after about a paragraph of writing and addressing some things, he comes back to the question and he says, to answer the question, what is wrong is or should be, I am wrong. What's wrong with the world? We are. The Bible gives us that picture. So the Bible is not, this is where a lot of people misunderstand. The Bible is not saying there's us and there's them. The Bible says there's all of us. And all of us have gone astray. All of us have done our own thing. Paul writes about this from Romans chapter 3, pulling these exact verses from Psalm 14. And he says, there's no one righteous, not even one. And he pulls from Ecclesiastes and Isaiah along with that. And he says, all have turned away. Their throats are open graves. Their mouths are full of cursing. The way of peace they do not know. And there is no fear of God before their eyes. This is God's verdict on mankind. We are all fools who've said in our hearts, there is no God. Romans 1:21 says, for although they knew God, they neither glorified him as God nor gave thanks to him, but their thinking became futile and their foolish hearts were darkened. There is, again, just a New Testament picture of what foolishness is. It's darkened hearts that say, I have no need for God. But the good news is that God saves fools. Verse 7 ends with this cry of hope. Oh, that salvation for Israel would come out of Zion. And the good news is salvation did come out of Zion. Salvation came in Jesus. Jesus is the opposite of the fool. Jesus is true wisdom. Jesus never once turned from God, never once acted in foolish pride. He's the only human that ever sought after God with his whole heart. He lived in perfect righteousness and perfect submission to the Father. And yet, Isaiah 53 tells us that Jesus, his life would go like this, and it did. We all like sheep have gone astray. We've all turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. God took the foolishness, our foolishness, and placed it on Jesus, the only true wisdom. And the cross itself looked like a cosmic failure. It looked like foolishness. In Colossians 1, it says, God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is low and despised so that no human being might boast in the presence of God. So Jesus is wisdom from God, Paul says. He becomes our righteousness, our sanctification, and our redemption. And in that, God saves fools. And he doesn't just save us, he transforms us. He gives us new hearts, hearts that begin to love wisdom, hearts that begin to say, I need God, I want God. And that comes from God coming and totally changing our hearts, to replace our heart of stone and give us a heart of flesh, as the Old Testament prophet said. So I want you to take a moment now and reflect on that. I want you to reflect on where you're at with God. This is truly like the story of the Bible, that all of us have gone and turned our own way, and yet through Jesus, we are offered a pathway to God, salvation to God. Where are you? Do you characterize yourself as a fool? Do you know that you're a fool? Do you know in your heart you said there's no God, and you know you need to call out to him?